Professor Lou Halberd lay in the doctor's arms, unmoving, eyes closed, her wizened right arm curled across her chest as if in the paroxysms of sudden rigor mortis. The doctor was on one knee to better support her, while Romana and Nathan Ivon stood over them, staring down with concern.
Is she dead?
Romana asked. The doctor looked up and did his best to smile. No, she merely fainted. I'm hopeful she will awaken shortly. Romana crouched down beside him.
Her arm.
She began quietly.
It looks like it's aged. Incredibly aged.
The doctor inclined his head gravely. It's worse than you think. Once adult, Albions do not normally show their age in the way we Gallifreyans eventually do. The Queen Empress Gloriana, for example, is pushing 120 and is indeed quite aged. But to look at her, you wouldn't know it. She could be 100 years her junior. Romana frowned.
Then what about Lou's skin? Her forearm? And her jacket?
Romana's voice trailed off as the truth began to dawn. The doctor nodded. I see you have it now. A very great deal of time must have passed beyond the base of the coffin. If she had passed through entirely, I doubt there'd have been anything but desiccated remains at her final destination. As it is, I'm hopeful her arm will eventually recover. I hope.
My, but you are quite brimming with optimism today,
Romana observed sardonically. A murmur and a groan arose from Lou. Her eyes flicked open. She looked around, confused, frowning angrily when she realized she was in the doctor's arms. Annoyed, she tried to rise under her own steam, but fell back as her strength failed her. Her expression transformed to one of horror as she saw her own ruined right arm. There, said the doctor, attempting to sound soothing. Just take it easy. We'll help you up, don't you worry. With this, the doctor and Romana aided the shaking Lou in finding her feet. Once standing, they each remained either side, helping hold her upright. The doctor glanced up once more at the mysterious sarcophagus, which had so effectively spirited away their mummified thief and ruined poor Lou's arm. The smoke which had formed the upended floor was beginning to show signs of thinning. Hints of an actual wooden floor were starting to poke through. The inner faces of the sides of the coffin were covered in the, by now familiar, pictogram writing. The doctor noticed something odd about those at the head end. Romana, look, he said softly. Among the strange symbols, a small group stood out. They appeared to be smoking, almost as if branded by a hot iron.
We should make some sort of record of that,
Romana suggested. The doctor nodded. It's at times like these I wish I'd brought a camera, or at least a notebook. Nathan coughed. The two Time Lords had almost forgotten he was there.
Perhaps I could be of service?
He proclaimed, opening up his trench coat. Underneath he was fully clothed, much to the doctor and Romana's relief, wearing brown slacks and an off-white creased shirt. He patted a sizable box on a strap slung around his neck, which until now had remained concealed.
My box brownie,
he explained with pride.
A camera. Never leave home without it.
Quickly, take a picture of these smouldering symbols, the doctor ordered sharply. Then he frowned as another thought struck him. Oh, and those around it too, just in case. We'll start back down with Lou. Hopefully we can find more aid for her in Sir Arthur's rooms. The doctor leaned a little closer to Romana, or failing that, possibly in the TARDIS. Romana nodded her understanding. Nathan flipped open the top of his box, the lid and front face folded over to hang down, revealing the camera itself. With another button pressed, the lens popped forward telescopically, while simultaneously a large disc popped up from where it had been lying on the top. As the doctor and Romana began to guide Lou back in the direction of the stairs, there was a large flash and a slight pop. Nathan had started work. The three companions reached the second-floor landing. Romana noticed an observation window to the inner courtyard of the Albion Imperial Museum, complete with impressive double-decker-sized wooden barrel filling its centre.
What is that thing?
Romana asked with impatient bemusement. The doctor raised an eyebrow and, in spite of Romana's continued upset towards him, could not suppress a mischievous smile. That, Romana, is a spaceship. Romana almost dropped Lou in her surprise, forcing the doctor to grab on more tightly. The injured professor moaned faintly in discomfort as Romana restabilized her own grip.
A spaceship? That thing? How, Doctor? It's made of wood. Where are the engines? How on Gallifrey would that thing ever work?
The doctor shook his head, chuckling softly. So many questions. Where to begin? Ah, well, I'll start with its point of origin. That is an ancient Chiroan spacecraft, possibly of the first era of Chiroan colonization of the Upsilon Orionis system. Romana shook her head in disbelief.
Ancient Chiroan? But that would make it thousands of years old. I can see it's an archaic design given all the wood, but how could it possibly be that old? And in such a complete and undamaged state?
That which killed the crew preserved the ship.
This came from Lou Halberd. It was the first thing she had said since the incident with the sarcophagus. Her voice sounded tired, weaker than usual, more subdued, but she was clearly conscious, aware of her surroundings, and alert. The Doctor and Romana glanced at each other. They knew it was a good sign.
These shipwrecks are a rare find.
Lou continued as they turned towards the stairs and began carefully to descend.
Even within one system, space is vast, while such ships are infinitesimally small. The chances of a modern ship coming anywhere near a wreck like this, captured in some eccentric orbit, are quite literally astronomically tiny. And yet, against all the odds, that was precisely what happened here about 50 years ago. It's from the middle period of ancient Chiroan settling of the system, probably at least 5,000 years old. Some part of its air seal must have failed, the crew died, but the vacuum of space preserved their bodies, cargo and the ship itself, with the attendant lack of decomposition or corrosion.
Fine.
Said Romana, returning her attention to the Doctor.
I appreciate how this thing came to be so old and yet so perfectly preserved. What I don't understand is how the hell they're supposed to get off the ground, let alone be interplanetary.
The Doctor waggled his eyebrows and the corners of his mouth twitched as he wrestled with the urge to look smug or pleased with himself. He was not entirely successful. Well, you see, Romana, it's something of a fluke of this system's geology, or chemistry, or physics. Anyway, whatever it is, the ancient Chiroans made a discovery deep underground. A liquid metal, similar in appearance to mercury, but which had in addition the remarkable property of being repulsed by gravity. By mixing it with other compounds, the Chiroans were able to produce a paint with the same properties. They called it cavorite. Romana's face oscillated between amazement and suspicion.
This sounds both remarkable and highly improbable. And yet it also sounds oddly familiar. I'm sure I've heard the name cavorite before.
The Doctor frowned and shook his head dismissively. There's nothing mysterious about its etymology. It was discovered in caves. It's a common enough linguistic habit to name something after its place of discovery, and add something to denote the class of material, caves, to cavorite. Quite simple, really.
Okay, so this miraculous substance persisted on the planet Cairo because it was trapped in caves. Otherwise, it would have flown off into space.
Romana stated. Exactly, the Doctor agreed heartily. In much the same way that helium is only discovered trapped in bubbles within ancient rocks, sealed in from the very formation of any given star system. Romana nodded.
Great. I'm still a little unclear on how one gets from flying paint to space-borne barrels. Or indeed how one prevents the paint jumping out of the tin as soon as it's opened. Or how you prevent the unopened tin launching itself into space.
The Doctor raised a familiar finger. By now all attempts to cover his pleasure utterly evaporated. Yes, of course. You see, there was, by happy chance, another material close by in the caves which was quickly noticed blocked the powers of the cavorite and kept it firmly grounded. They called it plumber, probably from a tendency to make things fall or plummet. Romana raised a sceptical eyebrow.
Now that really does sound familiar. Would it be what I think it is, by any chance?
The Doctor could not resist grinning. Maybe.
I thought so.
Romana replied with an eye roll. They were now standing in the main entrance hall of the museum. From there they could easily see the ancient Chiroan spaceship filling the interior courtyard. They could also see Timmy and Penny Cowley approaching. Lou shrugged off the support of the two Time Lords and took a step forward to stand unaided. Romana slapped the Doctor's upper arm with the back of her hand using moderate force.
I still want a full explanation of how that thing flies when time allows.
She hissed. Penny and Timmy now joined them in the entrance chamber. As they did so, Lou stuck her hands on her hips, striking a strong pose. The effect was spoiled, however, since she had forgotten the state of her arm. She moaned in pain and clutched the wrecked forearm across her chest with her left hand, eyes squeezed shut. The mouths of the married couple fell open in shock. Eyes wide, Penny stretched out her own right arm, palm facing Lou, fingers sprayed wide.
I sense something terrible has occurred.
Penny's voice boomed mysteriously, amplified by the room's acoustics. Really, said the doctor. What was your first clue? Romana slapped him again across the upper arm, but could not entirely suppress a smirk. They heard footsteps on the stairs behind, and found Nathan climbing down to join them.
I got all the photos you wanted,
he reported. The doctor nodded decisively. Excellent. I suggest we all repair to Sir Arthur's rooms, there to treat our wounded, and then determine what on Albia to do next. The entire party were now seated in Sir Arthur's office-cum-study. Romana had made a brief detour to the TARDIS and recovered an anaesthetic and moisturising salve, which had been applied to Lou's injuries. Well done on that find, the doctor had congratulated Romana.
Will it do any good?
She had asked. The doctor waggled his head noncommittally. I have no doubt the painkillers will. Whether her arm will ever return to its naturally youthful Albion norm, only time will tell. Now all were seated awaiting Sir Arthur's verdict upon their combined relaying of recent events. Lou's right arm was wrapped in bandages to keep the salve in place and prevent it leaving marks. The binding was unnervingly reminiscent of the very thief who had ultimately caused her injury. Sir Arthur ran a hand back through his hair as he considered his response.
Where in the funerary exhibit was the vandalized sarcophagus?
It was in the middle of the floor at the far end, the doctor supplied helpfully.
I took some pictures.
Nathan chipped in. He placed his box brownie on his lap, flipped open the case, and pressed another button. With a mechanical whir and a faint whiff of chemicals, 6 pictures about the dimensions of typical postcards fed out of the device. Ooh, the doctor exclaimed. I didn't know it could do that. Nathan's head bobbed proudly.
While our space tech might seem a little antiquated to use Xerons, I think you'll find our graphical technology quite advanced.
The doctor and Romana exchanged knowing raised eyebrows. An impatient huff now exploded from Lou Halberd.
It was Dr. Nugati's recent donation to the museum. You know the one, Arthur.
Sir Arthur's eyes widened, as if seized by a growing dread.
I know the one,
he muttered quietly to himself. Dr. Nugati, the doctor piped up. This name seems to hold some significance for you. How so? Sir Arthur was currently seated at a desk, everyone else on wooden chairs around it. There were various objects of interest, a globe of Albia, another globe-like system of wires, a model of the Upsilon Orionis system, no doubt, and a familiar leather wallet. From this last, Arthur withdrew several sheets of paper and held them out to the doctor, who duly took them.
Perhaps you would care to read these.
This was said with a weary air of one not keen to hear them.
And aloud, if you'd be so kind.
Lou chipped in impatiently. They were, as the doctor had expected, letters. He quickly leafed through them to ensure they were in date order. 6th September, he began. Arthur, I hope all finds you well, and that the dense air of Londra is agreeing with you after so long spent in hotter, drier climes. So, down to business. Discovered Nugati deep within the tunnel complex today, unaccompanied and behaving in a most disturbing manner. You know I've never taken to him, can't stand his intense staring silences, punctuated by that eerie, serene, Amharic drawl. Here the doctor paused. So he is a fellow native of Mr. Ivon's home island. Sir Arthur shook his head.
No. He lived and worked there for a long time, picked up the accent, but he is in fact from Hungary. I'll fill you in with more details shortly, but for now, please read on.
The doctor complied. And why he insists on that ridiculous dress in these baking conditions, I'll never know. High collar, long cuffs, even longer socks. If it weren't for his hands and face, I'd swear he was trying to hide some skin condition. Then again, his complexion has an oddly flat dullness to it in any event. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. The point is, I discovered him pacing in front of a nondescript section of wall, mumbling to himself in some harsh foreign tongue. I couldn't hear distinctly. It had some similarities with ancient or modern Kairoan, but mixed with something entirely alien. When I confronted him, he clammed up, fixed me with one of those damned stares, and walked out. I don't know what to do with him, but I swear I'll send him packing if I have to deal with any more of his rum doings. Your friend, Raymond White, Logistics Officer. The doctor looked up to regard Sir Arthur with a piercing stare. This Dr. Nugati, a rich donor, I presume. Is that how he inveigled his way into your party? Do you know him well? Sir Arthur nodded, but this gesture dissolved into a remorseful shaking of the head.
I've met Newgate a few times, mainly because of the odd conditions attached to his donation. He insisted he be allowed to join this season's Anubis tomb expedition to make his own assessment of any finds he claimed. This condition was acceded to on the understanding that museum personnel supervised him at all times and was solely responsible for the safekeeping of all discoveries. Dr. Newgate remained with the team after I returned to Albion. Then I began to receive this disturbing correspondence. It was only just now, when you told me of your experiences with the sarcophagus, that I began to see the horrific connections between everything. Oh, what have I done to my friends?
These last words came as a cry as Sir Arthur plunged his head into his hands. The doctor stood up and walked over to the desk. Showing unusual empathy, he placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. You take too much upon yourself. You have not perpetrated any crimes or made any actions in bad faith. If anyone has, it may be Newgate, but even then, from what little we know, we cannot say. Sir Arthur looked up into the doctor's eyes and sighed deeply.
I know you mean well, but I shall never forgive myself. Please, skip to the last letter.
The doctor returned to his seat. 30th September. Arthur, thank whatever gods watch over this dusty and unforgiving place. Newgate is gone, packed up and left this morning. Very moving it was, too. Shook each of us by the hand and stared us intently in the eyes, a pleasure I could easily have forgone, then was trucked back to Abydos. He was not exactly forthcoming over his plans, but I understand he was heading back to Albia via the fastest means available. Keep your eyes open, as you may well find him visiting you in the near future. Your friend, Raymond White. The doctor folded the letters and placed them in an inside pocket. Rum doings, he muttered to himself, looking up at the ceiling. Then his eyes snapped down upon the hapless Sir Arthur. And did he? The doctor inquired. Sir Arthur frowned.
Did who what?
Did Newgate pay you a visit? The doctor clarified.
No. I've not seen hide nor hair of our generous, if eccentric, benefactor. He has a home in North Westwood, in the borough of Dulwich, and, as I understand it, quite a considerable private collection of ancient artifacts. In fact, I believe he has at least one of the matching sarcophagi there. The bulk of his antiquities are at his native home near Buda on Hung area, where he is better able to store and display them, I suppose.
The doctor nodded to himself, smiling. Perhaps it is time we paid the elusive doctor a house call, he declared briskly, rising to his feet. Then he looked a little less certain. Although, how exactly do we get to Dulwich? He asked a little sheepishly. Now it was Sir Arthur's turn to smile, a welcome revelation that he was still capable. He gestured to the globe of Albia, and as he spoke the doctor and Romana moved to examine it.
You see that most of our main landmass,
Grand
Bretagne, is a vast archipelago spreading mostly north-south, almost from pole to pole, our all-encompassing Atlantic Ocean wrapping from our western extremities to our eastern ones. Londra's geography is no exception. Its many boroughs mostly separated by narrow stretches of that same body of water. Dulwich lies to the south of central Londra. I'll telecom for some cabbies to take you to Gloriana Station. From there are regular trains to North Westwood. You will get to see our magnificent oceanic viaducts. We're quite proud of our industrial prowess.
He finished with a hint of a prideful turn to his lips. The doctor and Romana nodded their thanks. Romana turned back to the globe of Albia.
I suppose it isn't really that Earth-like.
She conceded to herself. For once, the doctor was wise enough to keep his mouth shut. Meanwhile, Sir Arthur had placed the combined mouth and earpiece of the telecom to his face and begun to turn a numbered dial on its stand. Romana's attention now turned to the orrery-like wire sphere. She frowned as she noticed the name plaque underneath.
Terra Cognita?
She said with a mixture of curiosity and distaste. Well, the doctor began, ever helpful when showing off. I imagine it's some homage to, or joke at the expense of, Terra Incognita, which means...
I know what it means,
Romana interrupted.
but it is more usually applied to a single planet rather than a whole star system.
Romana's irritation subsided a little.
But yes, I suppose you're right, in that they repurposed and re-engineered the phrase for this wider context. Non-lens, indeed.
She muttered, shaking her head. Sir Arthur had clearly reached the cabbie booking office. In the centre of the numbered dial, a tiny circular screen showed the moving face of a booking agent. Finally, he put down the handset.
That's it. You're all set to go. They'll be here by 6 this morning. I suggest you all try to get what rest you can in the few hours remaining. Now I have to phone the police. Again.
The Doctor and Romana made their excuses and left, returning to the TARDIS.
Why exactly are we now part of this expedition?
Romana asked the Doctor, mild irritation still colouring her tone. It seemed an excellent excuse for free passage to Cairo. The Doctor responded cheerfully. Don't you agree?
And...
She encouraged, eyebrow raised. The Doctor's face became serious. And I was very disturbed by what I discovered when I scanned the scarab. K9! The robot dog whirred into view.
Master?
He chirruped. Ah, there's a good boy. I need you to give a full analysis of this. The Doctor said, holding out the sonic screwdriver.
Master? A frequency-generating and scanning device, normally for causing gyration in threaded cylinders.
The Doctor frowned. That is not what I meant. Come here, he ordered querulously. K9 trundled a little closer. The Doctor placed the base of the screwdriver against K9's head. The device gave a brief fluting buzzing sound, while K9's ears twirled.
All data assimilated, Master.
Excellent, the Doctor cooed. Now, the scarab beetle. I detected oddities in its composition. Could you confirm this? K9 whirred a little further.
72% materials native to the Upsilon Orionis system, 28% of other origins.
More precisely? K9 thought a moment longer.
28% nth material.
The Doctor sighed. As I suspected. I think we have added cause to pursue this thing. Whoever does want it may not have the universe's best interests at heart. At least not this universe, our fragile bubble. Romana inclined her head in agreement.
Consequences. Ever consequences,
she said significantly. The party left for Gloriana Station shortly after 6 in 2 black cabbies. Cabbie, it transpired, being the name of the vehicle rather than the drivers on Albia. These cars shared many of the sweeping lines and aesthetics of late 20s or early 30s Earth vehicles. They even seemed powered by some form of combustion engine, if the noise and vapours given off were any indication. Nathan, Timmy and Penny took one, while the Doctor, Romana and Lou the other. The injured professor had insisted on joining them in spite of her injury. She had brushed away all attempts to encourage her to rest, proclaiming impatiently that she was fine. Gloriana Station was a grand neo-Gothic red brick building containing a dozen platforms to southerly destinations, including Dulwich and northwestward. And there were trains! For anyone who might be vaguely excited by such things, they all shared streamlining reminiscent of the Mallard. And they were all steam! Whatever the means of heating the boilers, this was clearly their means of locomotion. The Doctor stifled the urge to grin and jump up and down on the spot.
I am constantly amazed that a species so backward ever managed to colonize space,
Romana pronounced, rolling her eyes. They found their train, a bottle-green engine pulling letterbox red coaches, and then their carriage. The party entered their compartment for 6 and settled in. The Doctor sat with a leather satchel on his lap, its single strap over one shoulder. This addition to his outfit had been picked up during the Time Lord's return to the TARDIS. He seemed quite taken with all this low technology they were now immersed in, and had put various useful items into this slim bag, including a notepad and pen. Romana eyed his new accessory with a, by now customary, look of weary disappointment. It was clear he, at least, was enjoying himself. The train left the station. For the first 500 metres or so they were travelling through the backs of the city buildings, mostly more red brick, a few of artificial sandy stone. Various other tracks rapidly spread away from theirs, curving off in different directions. Then they were over the ocean. Admittedly, it was clearly a narrow stretch of sea, their destination presumably the landmass ahead, separated from London Main by no more distance than, say, the Isle of Wight from Portsmouth. Nevertheless, The iron and brick viaduct they were on, coupled with this wave-topped tract of water, was an undeniably impressive sight. Other islands could be seen to the east and west, connected to the mainland by similar tall, many-arched bridges, the various boroughs of South Londra. No doubt they were also interlinked through still more elevated lines. At last their train was once again over dry land, passing between the backs of houses, often overlooking their rear gardens. The train slowed. A platform and station buildings appeared at the window, crawled by, then stopped. They had arrived at North Westward. Standing on the platform, they watched the beautiful green and red train depart and considered their best course of action. "Right," the doctor said. "I suppose we should find Dr. Newgatty's house, invite ourselves in, and have a little chat." He was surprised when his plan was not met with universal approval.
I'm no detective or archaeologist,
Timmy began.
but in my line of work, namely security, I prefer to check out the lie of the land, gather some intel, sound out for potential threats. I suggest we question the locals where they are at their most voluble, the local pub.
Romana, the doctor, and Lou all exchanged sceptical glances. Nathan was strangely quiet and unusually inscrutable, betraying nothing of his own opinion. "You may have a point," the doctor conceded, with barely concealed impatience. "Perhaps if we split our party, we can cover more ground. You two check out the local watering hole." Here the doctor paused, staring up at the station clock. "Assuming it's open at 9 o'clock in the morning," he added, "while the rest of us make a more direct approach to Newgatty."
I'll go with them.
This surprising announcement came from Lou. The surprise was most evident on the faces of the two Time Lords, who had thought her above such diversions. Lou frowned at them, had clearly noticed their lack of comprehension, and consequently found them wanting.
Someone has to keep them on task.
She explained shortly. This did nothing to endear her to the Cowleys, but neither felt able to object. And so the three moved off along the platform, heading for the exit. The doctor and Romana realized they were not alone.
I'm surprised you didn't join them.
Romana noted. It was Nathan's turn to raise an eyebrow.
Now, I may not be a security expert or an esteemed archaeologist, but one thing I am is a detective. And in my humble experience, the fastest way to solving a crime is by questioning suspects.
The doctor shrugged. "I can't argue with your logic there. Now, we have the address of Dr. Newgatty, but I imagine none of us are familiar with North Westward, am I right?" Nathan and Romana nodded. "Never fear," the doctor declared. "I have a cunning plan." With that he strode briskly off down the platform, stopping in front of a small building near its end, and rapped upon its door. This opened, and through it emerged the grey-uniformed station master.
Yes, can I help you?
He inquired politely. "I do hope so," the doctor confided cheerily, or what he hoped passed for cheerily. "We were wondering if you know of Dr. Newgatty, a local resident of some note, we understand." The station master eyed them warily.
Well, you'll be wanting Dunbar House, if that really is what you want,
he said cautiously. "It is indeed," the doctor confirmed. "Could you possibly provide some directions?" The station master frowned.
My first would be, don't go,
he said ominously. The three companions exchanged puzzled glances. The station master shook his head.
But I suppose there's no discouraging some people. Turn right outside the station, then right again onto the High Street. That will take you past the front of North Westward Cemetery. Dunbar House's grounds share a boundary wall with the cemetery. If you keep going, you'll reach the end of the graveyard's west wall and find Dunbar House's drive on your left. But I wouldn't go to either if I were you.
Romana cocked her head.
Why are you so wary of this place? Is it some sort of superstition over the dead?
The station master shuffled uncomfortably and looked a little defensive.
I'd hate you to think we're simpletons out here, madam, but people have been talking about the strange doctor and his nocturnal wanderings. Seen him once or twice myself, and his stare scares the willies out of me. And the cemetery's been locked up this past month. Some nonsense about wild dogs wandering around menacing people, digging at the graves and the like. The place has high walls and iron fencing, so you'd think it's secure enough. Yet one of the places people say they've seen Dr. Newgatty wandering around is inside.
"Thank you for your help and advice," the doctor said. All three companions exchanged dubious glances. Together they left the station and followed the directions to the front of North Westward's burial ground. In spite of it being broad daylight, exactly when you might expect to see visitors, Its gates were shut and secured with multiple chains and padlocks. This side of the cemetery was bounded by a brick wall at least 12 feet high. The doctor, Romana and Nathan followed this south along the main road until it ended, turning east away from them. Barely 6 feet beyond this, a gravel drive led in that same direction. Stuck in the soil near where they stood was a modest sign reading Dunbar House. Timmy, Penny and Lou had arrived outside the Horns Tavern. There was one old man sitting on a bench with a pint, walking stick clasped between his knees. The pub was open. Timmy and Lou strode boldly in, followed more serenely by Penny. Inside the pub there were only a couple of small groups seated at scattered tables, and no one currently at the bar save the barman. Quiet though it already was, a total hush fell upon the place with the entry of the museum trio. Timmy looked round at the wary eyes cast in their direction and decided to take charge.
"Drinks for everyone,"
he called out cheerfully. In response, the barman folded his arms across his chest, frowning at him.
"I don't know what you take us for, but I can tell you one thing we're not: hired help. This is my pub. I'm the landlord, and I don't take kindly to showy fellows from the city throwing their money around thinking they own the place. You're all barred."
Timmy spluttered a few times, but they could all see the owner was utterly intransigent. Crestfallen, they trudged back out onto the pavement.
"Well, that went well,"
Lou said scornfully.
"That's not the usual reaction I expect to free drinks."
Timmy snapped back.
"Perhaps you've been hanging around with the wrong sort of people."
Lou responded haughtily. Before things could get out of hand, Penny stepped in.
"I noticed the local shop 2 doors down.
She began soothingly.
Perhaps we might have more luck there?"
Following her finger to where it was pointing, the others found the shop. An elaborately lettered signboard above the door and display window read, "Vasey's Fine Victuals." They wandered over for a closer look. The window showed quite a broad range of foodstuffs, as well as many less edible household items. A bell above the door rang as they made their entrance. The doctor, Romana and Nathan had arrived in front of the grand entrance of Dunbar House. Well, grand up to a point. The driveway they had followed showed signs of some regular vehicle use, partly evident through the potholes gouged out from the gravel. This same air of, if not neglect, then at least a certain lack of maintenance extended to the house itself. The windows and walls looked in need of cleaning, some of the gutterings sagged, and 1 or 2 of the roof tiles seemed out of alignment. The doctor walked boldly up and rapped on the door using the ornate brass knocker. They heard no sounds from within. The only response was that all the lights went out. Not in the house, there were no lights there anyway. The entire world was suddenly plunged into darkness. "What the hell is that?" the doctor cried, pointing up into the darkened sky. Romana also looked up in shock, although this was more at the doctor being finally surprised by this world. The sun had only been about 30 degrees above the horizon. It was after all only mid-morning. Now it had been entirely swallowed by a partial disk which must have been at least 10 times its diameter. This segment rose like a mountain against the horizon, more than half the circle obscured below. Where the sun had disappeared, a brighter patch of sky persisted, but this was fading fast. Nathan frowned at the Time Lords.
It's just the eclipse. Surely you guys know about that. Happens same time every year. Whereas our moon is quite close and on a polar orbit. Once a year it crosses the horizon just in time to catch the sun. Then the day turns and light returns, in a couple of hours anyway.
The doctor smoothed down his jacket and unruffled his nerves. "Of course, Wellas. It had just slipped my mind for a moment." Romana could not suppress a smile.
Of course. And you in no way thought your knock had caused it. It seems to have had no effect whatsoever.
The doctor harumphed and withdrew his sonic screwdriver. Nathan, guessing his intention, coughed and raised a hand.
"If I might make so bold,"
he began cordially.
"in my experience the rear doors are often easier to jimmy."
The doctor inclined his head graciously. "I bow to your greater experience. Lead on, good sir." Night had fallen just as Timmy, Penny and Lou had entered Vasey's local shop, but they gave it not a second thought. They had just crossed the threshold when Penny gently gripped Timmy's upper arm and gave him a look which said, "Let me handle this." Timmy silently nodded his assent. Lou also understood the mute exchange and, for now, decided to play along. An old couple stood behind the shop counter. While there was little in their skin or faces to give away their age, their clothes and posture betrayed the generational gap.
Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Vasey, I presume?
Penny said politely.
Yes, right you are,
said Mrs. Vasey.
Can we be of assistance?
Oh, I do hope so.
Penny gushed gratefully.
You see, I'm a psychic. Strange sensations drew me here to North Westwood. Perhaps it was the cemetery? Tell me, have you noticed any strange or otherworldly goings-on hereabouts?
Mr. and Mrs. Vasey exchanged apprehensive glances, but clearly decided they liked the look of Penny Cowley.
Well now,
Mr. Vasey began.
I'm not sure everything odd round here could be called otherworldly, but even that's not is damned odd if you ask me.
Language, George!
Mrs. Vasey chipped in, appalled.
Sorry, love, but you know it's true. Just seeing that Dr. Nayogati cruising around in his big black car, staring out at everyone, it's enough to give anyone the creeps. I saw him doing just that late last night. Looks like he was heading towards the Dulwych Croydon Bridge, as best as I could tell. Anyway, creepy as hell.
George!
Mrs. Vasey butted in again.
Sorry, love, but you know it's true. Tell him about the animals.
Doubt appeared to edge back into Mrs. Vasey's eyes.
Well, I'm not sure we should be telling you anything. We don't know you. You're not local people. For all we know, you might be the ones causing the trouble.
At this, Penny held up her hands, making soothing noises. This proved effective.
We've recently lost a lot of livestock from the yard. Not all at once, mind, but in ones and twos over several weeks. There's no rhyme or reason to these thefts. A calf here, a lamb there, a duck and a chicken, a pig and a goat. And then the children. Those cruel and nasty children. They play at night and have no respect for their elders. Spreading rumors. Nasty, vicious rumors. Say they've seen our animals running around at night. Only they say they're all muddled up. I think they're trying to blacken our names. Make people think we're witches or devil worshippers. They're so cruel.
Mrs. Vasey was clearly quite upset. Lou frowned.
So you think there's nothing more than petty thefts and pranks afoot, and ultimately it all boils down to the children?
She was clearly already convinced that no relevant information was to be found here. Mrs. Vasey nodded, but her husband shook his head.
Sorry, love,
he began preemptively.
But it's not the children I'm worried about. At least not in the ways you mean, Gertrude.
Lou cocked her head at him.
Please, sir, go on. I'd really appreciate it if you'd elaborate.
George Vasey shifted a little, clearly uncomfortable. Beyond the kitchen of Dunbar House, once a small connecting corridor had been negotiated, things began to look up, at least in terms of decor. There was still no sign of their quarry.
Say, this sure is fancy,
came Nathan's assessment as he stared around at the spacious entrance hall. From where they stood, they could now see the other side of the front door opposite them, although both this and the windows to either side lay behind heavy floor-length curtains covered in oddly disturbing paisley patterns. To their left, a grand wooden staircase led up to the first-floor landing, and from there to the floors above. This was easily seen since the entrance hall itself stretched up to the canted ceiling formed by the roof. Perhaps the most impressive features of this room were the various display cases scattered around the walls, crammed with various museum-worthy artifacts and antiquities of obscure origins. Something in one of these had caught Nathan's eye, as he wandered over to get a closer look. The doctor coughed. Perhaps we should split up and search more efficiently. I somehow doubt the scarab or Dr. Nugatti will be on display in any of these, but by all means start here if you wish. Nathan frowned at this slight rebuke, then shrugged it off. 20 minutes later, the doctor and Nathan were running through the house from different locations, heading towards the sound of Romana's yell. They ran into each other when they reached the entrance hall, then with a nod agreed on the most likely doorway to choose. Upon opening the door, the sight before them was remarkably anticlimactic. Romana stood at the angled turn of the corridor she was in, next to a discreet alcove, gesturing to it with a sweep of her hand in inexplicable pride. As the doctor and Nathan approached, a small partially concealed door was revealed, which had clearly been opened by Romana.
I found the cellar,
Romana said with pride. The doctor nodded approvingly. Well done. I have found things of great significance in cellars in the recent past, he said archly.
I'll take your word for it.
Romana responded neutrally, to which the doctor looked oddly awkward. He then brushed this aside by taking the lead through the door and down the narrow spiralling stairs. Using the dim light from his sonic screwdriver, the Doctor found a light switch. He flicked it, and a sizable but low-ceilinged cellar was revealed. The trio took a few steps inside to better see the oddly disturbing array of objects before them. The walls were lined with shelving, much of which was stacked with brown glass bottles, similar to 20th century Earth medical or chemical bottles. There were also several larger clear jars containing an upsetting variety of organs and other body parts. Whether they were animal, Albion, or a mixture of both was impossible to tell. This uncertainty did nothing to ease the tension. In the centre of the floor nearby stood a rather antiquated-looking wooden operating table, heavily stained. Some might be dried blood, but several seemed to be of wrong colours. To the side of this macabre workbench was a lectern-like writing stand, also of aged wood, upon which a few scraps of paper and a small notebook had been abandoned. However, the most striking object had to be that which stood facing them towards the far end of the room. It was a sarcophagus, identical to the one they had encountered in the Albion Imperial Museum. Like the aforementioned troublesome tomb, it too stood balanced upon one end, with its lid removed. The lid was leaning against a nearby set of shelves by the wall. The floor of the sarcophagus looked utterly unremarkable, wooden, and with no signs of ethereal oily smoke. There was, though, a substantial pile of beige dust or powder in front of it, a peculiar concentration in an otherwise dust-free if grimy cellar. Nathan and the Doctor both wandered to the ancient wooden coffin, while Romana stepped lithely over to the standing desk. The Doctor peered at the inside surface of the casket, paying particular attention to the head end. He noticed some of the pictograms looked blackened and scorched. He removed one of the photos from his shoulder bag to confirm this. Upon closer inspection, it appeared that some additional pictograms were scorched in this sarcophagus compared to that in the museum. The Doctor was about to ask Nathan if he could take some pictures, and turned to face him, only to discover he was not there. Looking down, he found him on all fours, bending towards the mound of dust, his tongue stuck out. With an exasperated roll of his eyes, he realized Nathan was about to lick it. Just as the tip of his tongue touched the top of the pile, his breath must have disturbed some, as a small puff wafted past his nose. Nathan sneezed uncontrollably, his face buried up to his ears in the suspicious powder. He gave a muffled shout of surprise and pain as he quickly withdrew his dust-covered head, clamping a hand over his mouth. A small line of blood could be seen dribbling down his chin.
"Something cut my tongue,"
Nathan declared indignantly, muffled by both hand and injury. The Doctor crouched down next to Nathan and the remaining pile of dust. It now contained a fairly recognisable cast of the private investigator's face. The Doctor reached carefully into the depression left by Nathan's mouth. He gingerly grasped something and withdrew it.
The glass shard from the museum,
Romana cried from where she was standing.
"The one I threw in after that mummy guy."
Nathan added excitedly, then winced with renewed pain. Exactly. And I think we can be fairly confident we've caught our thief, or what's left of him, the Doctor said, waving to the desiccated pile.
accelerated time.
Romana noted grimly.
What do you mean?
Nathan mumbled.
It would take 1,000 years or more for something like that to happen to a preserved corpse.
The Doctor inclined his head. Indeed it would. Remember Lou's arm? Imagine what might have happened to it, to all of her in fact, if she had successfully passed through. I imagine we would have a much larger pile. Trust me, Nathan. We've seen something tampering with the dimensions of our universe in a similar fashion before. I fear things are becoming more dangerous than you could possibly imagine. Romana coughed.
Well, if you finish playing sandcastles over there, I've made 1 or 2 fascinating discoveries of my own. Firstly, at a cursory glance, we might find some useful clues as to where certain artifacts and individuals may be found here,
she said, holding up the slips of paper and the notebook, before stuffing them into the pockets of her leather jacket.
However,
she continued, walking over to one of the racks of shelves,
this might actually reveal the whereabouts of Nugati himself.
With this, she grabbed both sides of the shelf, pulling it forward and pivoting around by 90 degrees. There, embedded in the wall, stood a rough wooden door. It was secured from the cellar side by a heavy iron bolt and hasp, but showed no other locks or handles. Nathan stood up, and he and the Doctor joined Romana. It seems a little unlikely that the good doctor would have entered there, closed the door, then bolted it from this side, the doctor observed. Romana shrugged a tiny concession, acknowledging the problem.
Perhaps he had a servant close it behind him? In any event, do you have a better suggestion as to where to look?
The doctor waggled his head noncommittally, then he threw back the bolt. Finally, George Vasey plucked up the courage to continue.
Last week, some boys were up to some mischief in the small hours next to the cemetery fence, claimed to see old James Newell run up the fence from inside. He was wild and raving, and what's worse, he had only been buried 3 days. Goes without saying, the boys ran, but one of them, little Bobby Perkins, thought he saw other figures moving inside the graveyard, swears he saw a flash of moonlight on Dr. Nayogati's glasses.
Here Mr. Vasey paused, frowning, as his own doubts began to take hold.
Others say the boy has too much imagination, that there was no way he could have known who they were in the dark, assuming he saw anything at all. In the morning, the cemetery was searched, and no one was found. Old Newell's grave was still heaped with fresh earth, just like it had been 3 days earlier. Mixed up animals and dead men walking around makes no sense, I know, but there's something rum going on in Dulwich, make no mistake.
Lou, Timmy, and Penny each exchanged glances of increasing concern and trepidation. The doctor, Romana, and Nathan stood in the very heart of North Westwood Cemetery. Upon opening the door in the cellar, they discovered an unlit brick-lined tunnel leading to a set of stone steps some 50 yards distant. At the top of these stairs they knew instantly they were inside a tomb of neoclassical design, its glazed iron door fortunately unlocked. Outside there were many similar cubic tombs with high-pitched roofs, all in stone and slate, augmented with pillars and sculptures. The three looked around them at the impressive if gloomy scenery, pondering their next move.
No sign of Newgatti,
Nathan observed. Romana frowned, but found herself unable to disagree. The doctor looked up into the starry, eclipse-born sky, then at the paths, trees, and graves around them. He gave a nod of satisfaction. "Unless I'm very much mistaken," the doctor began.
Perish the thought,
Romana interjected. The doctor frowned, then ploughed on. "Then we are facing due north. Behind us should be the wall bordering Dunbar House. If I am right, and we follow the path ahead, taking the first major path left, we should be heading towards the main gates."
I don't doubt your sense of direction,
Romana began, almost without sarcasm.
but what exactly do you hope to find there?
The doctor smiled knowingly. Clearly, the good doctor has not set up residence in this tiny tomb. However, if he's somehow making use of this currently locked cemetery, he may have utilized some of the administration buildings next to the main gate. I noticed them as we walked by earlier. Romana nodded slowly, accepting his point. They had barely walked 20 meters before something jumped out at them. The thing hissed and growled, its body obviously feline, or some Albion example of convergent evolution. It was a little larger than your average Earth tabby, being more similar to a lynx, but otherwise its structure and movements were indistinguishable. Its head, however, was terribly wrong. It was the head of an Albion man. It lolled a little drunkenly on its feline neck. The forehead had a line running across it, which from its course might encircle the entire cranium. The line itself was a dark red, the colour of dried blood. It was hard to be sure, but it almost seemed like there was some texture or patterning to the line, a vague impression of stitching, perhaps. "Albion cats are a little larger than Earth ones," the doctor told Romana in response to her aghast face.
but don't usually have some guy's head.
Nathan added, sharing Romana's horrified expression. The creature bared its Albion teeth and gave an oddly feline sound, something between a growl and a mew. Then it dashed into nearby bushes and disappeared.
Doctor, what has been going on here?
Romana hissed. "Something Albions were never meant to know," he said significantly, nodding towards Nathan.
I can hear you, you know.
The detective muttered grumpily. They found a significant path heading in the direction the doctor had suggested a few yards further on, and turned down it. Just as they began to see signs of the gates and the small administration huts, they heard cries.
Doctor!
Fred!
Nathan!
They sounded like Timmy, Lou, and Penny. They also sounded urgent. As they reached this chained barrier, they saw the Cowleys and Professor Halberd, arms stretched through the bars, waving frantically.
Doctor! Fred! Nathan! I have sensed terrible things.
Penny's voice boomed. Lou frowned at her, shaking her head.
More than that,
She added impatiently.
we have more concrete and disturbing warnings.
The doctor nodded slowly and gravely, with a strange expression on his face. He tapped Romana and Nathan on the shoulders. I think it may be a little late, he said quietly, and turned away from the gate to look behind them. Half a dozen Albion individuals stood no more than 10 yards away, shambling towards them, plus something which looked like a pig with the head of a goat. These 6 people looked far from normal themselves. All of them, while deathly pale, had lost some measure of the shine to their skins. Their eyes generally looked a touch milky too. Still more bizarre, several looked like they had undergone recent surgery, lines of stitches crossing an arm here or a neck there. Most obviously grotesque, one pair seemed to be a mother and daughter, to judge from their matching outfits, but from their ill-fitting nature it seemed the limbs of one had been swapped with the other. The child towered over the mother, in spite of having the face of a 9-year-old, while the mother tottered on tiny legs, forced to hitch up her overlong dress with equally tiny hands and arms. The group stopped barely 5 yards before the Time Lords and Nathan. One man stepped forward from the group. He looked more normal than some, inasmuch as he showed no signs of surgery, but his skin was just as lackluster and his eyes no less milky. He opened his mouth to speak. It was hard to say whether it was the voice itself or the words that were more chilling. He spoke as if his tongue were dry from wandering the desert for days. His voice cracked and tormented as one suffering the greatest mental agonies. The words were almost overshadowed by the tone. Almost, but not quite.
Kill them,
he intoned monotonously.